Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries RPG podcast with John and Hannah.
Hi.
And today, Hannah's going to be talking to us about why she likes the second ed artwork over some of the more recent stuff. So, love, what is it you like so much about the second ed D&D artwork?
I think I like that it looks just a little bit amateurish, and that's not a bad thing, and hopefully I'll be able to sort of explain why over the course of doing this.
Okay, so when you say sort of amateurish, what do you mean by that? How do you mean amateurish?
Well, when you look at the current D&D books,
yeah,
they've got these amazing, fantastic, full-colour pictures. There's loads of depth and tone to every image. You can tell that that's been like a lot of time has been spent on that by a very professional artist who's very skilled, and being someone that knows Photoshop, you can tell that it's then been gone back to with a computer and cleaned up and improved on even more.
Yeah, you can definitely tell that a lot of time, money and expertise has been put behind like the more recent artwork, to use like 5th edition as an example.
Now, the second ed artwork sort of looks, well, most of it like I might be able to do something that's almost as good myself. Okay. And I think that's part of the appeal for me. There's a lot of line drawings, a lot of pencil drawings, there's watercolour stuff, and there's a lot of solid colour print stuff. Okay. In the 1970s, when they were doing this, the quickest, cleanest way to get a nice image was to get an artist to draw it for you, put that into whatever the scanner equivalent was in the 70s, and then print it with 3-colour printing. And I'm assuming that's what's been done with the second ed book.
So is that like screen printing, effectively?
Effectively, yeah. It's the way that you'll see like newspapers being made and that kind of thing. Yeah, so because it's a cheap, clean.
Yeah, you overlay the colours in different blocks, and that gets your final result.
The initial artwork, therefore, is being directly translated onto the page, or most of it is, and then there'll be certain adjustments with the colours. It's a bit more complicated than that, but basically you're just putting a drawing straight onto a page. Yeah. Whereas now, you will start with an initial piece of artwork, and you'll be able to load that into a computer, put it into Photoshop or an equivalent, fiddle with the colours, change the cropping on it, maybe even cut out a whole element and make it bigger, or a million other things.
Now, I should point out, for anyone who's listening who is unaware of this, you spent a good amount of time working for one of those sort of photo to canvas sort of places where you spent a lot of time working on Photoshop, so you know your way around Photoshop, you know some of the tips and tricks. We're not saying this to brag, obviously, we're just saying this to give you an idea that sort of Hannah has a bit of an idea about what she's talking about when it comes to Photoshop and computer manipulation and images and things like that.
Again, none of this is a bad thing to get a good, high-quality picture. And the artwork in the 5th ed book is generally looks more real, whereas often in the second ed book it can look a bit cartoony.
Yeah, I suspect part of the feature of the style of the 5th edition artwork in sort of like the current version of D&D is because obviously it's Wizards of the Coast, and Wizards of the Coast are best known really for Magic the Gathering. So there's a lot of detailed artwork on each of those cards. So I expect Wizards of the Coast already has a large pool of artists that they draw from who are used to working in that particular style.
Indeed. Whereas the second ed book was made by a very small number of artists.
How many are we talking?
Well, I'm just going to read through the list of the people who did the illustrations. We've got Tony DiTerlizzi. I can never pronounce that name, but I'm pretty sure he actually does some of the Magic cards as well, or did back when I played Magic. We've got Jeff Butler. I'm a big fan of the images that Jeff Butler's put in here. He's done most of the humans, things like the genie. That's a particularly nice image,
that is a nice picture.
as far as I'm concerned. We've got Dave Simmons, who's done inks and colours on normal animals, almost normal animals, and squishy things. We've got Mark Nelson, who was the dinosaurs and dragons guy. We've got Tom Baxter, who did the Gith kind, and then we've got Les Dorsheed. I do apologise, I'm terrible at pronouncing names. Who was the one who went through and did all the colours for most of the book to make all these different artists' images look just that bit more together. And then there's the very important credit to Tim Beach and Doug Stewart, two artists who worked on The Invisible Stalker, which is of course just a blank box on the page. I imagine they probably both had quite a lot to do with the illustrations but didn't actually do any of the drawing. That's why they've got a credit there. I expect you'd probably be able to look up the story behind that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's one of the things that I like as well about the sort of AD&D second edition Monster Manual and the earlier stuff as well, is that although it's like a completely working game, it's got lovely artwork in it and stuff like that, there's a sense that it's still sort of like a fairly sort of like young company, and they're still having a bit of fun with it. There's a few like in-jokes here and there, a bit of sort of fun and games. Whereas I certainly think later on, I feel like it becomes more of a serious drive to produce a slick finished product, which is obviously great. You know, if you're paying your money and you get a slick finished product, happy days. But for me personally, I do like these little in-jokes and these little bits of sense of humour that sort of come through in these earlier products, particularly.
One of the things that you'll notice there is that they had particular people assigned for particular like groups of creatures, and that will be another way that they've kept the costs down, because obviously again this was a very small company trying to make the best product they could in 1970s. So that's how it ended up looking the way it does. But I think for me, looking at it in the 1980s and the 1990s, it was artwork that I could trace and use in my game and make little adjustments to. It was artwork that I could use as inspiration and know that I could make something that wasn't quite as good but was close enough that my 15-year-old friends weren't going to be taking the mick out of me when I pulled it out in a game.
Yeah, you could get something close to it, yeah.
Indeed. And it sort of got me thinking to how now, with the artwork being so much higher quality, it's quite intimidating to sit there and try and draw your own picture of a monster. And it tends to sort of force people to like I'll just Google this. And I worry that it's sort of cutting out a part of the game by being that intimidating sort of a thing.
Yeah, and it's an interesting point you make about obviously the internet, which has both positives and negatives like anything. But obviously it's far easier now, if you want to find a picture of a monster, to just go online, quick Google image search, happy days. Whereas obviously, like you say, in the 80s and the 90s, that wasn't popular. So if you were running your own game, you had to, and you wanted to come with your own monster, you had to either rely on like pure description, which is what I know I tended to do, or like you seem to have done, you had to either draw your own from scratch or take some of these earlier artworks, trace over them, and adapt them a little bit. So you'd be like, oh, I've got this creature, it's a bit like a knoll but like with horns and whatever. All right, I'll trace a bit of this and I'll draw that on it. And that's really part of the whole sort of like, I suppose, DIY sort of early ethos of the earlier D&D products, which is something I really love and I've got a great deal of nostalgia for even nowadays.
And part of it isn't about how the images are drawn so much as what's done to them after.
Yeah.
These are very simple line drawings that have been made for that cheaper printing process. So when you can print a full colour photo quality image, you're sort of tempted to print a full colour photo quality image. And those are a lot more difficult to trace, they're a lot more difficult to use unless you've got the computer software and you're familiar with that. And I know that in more recent times I have been using Photoshop for game props.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just that it's moved on that bit. But it just got me thinking about how the artwork there is a lot more like the art I used to draw. And this is so much beyond me, I'd never attempt to try and replicate it.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, as you mentioned earlier, there's maybe 8 artists in the original books, something like that. It's not a lot of them, and that's in the monster manual for AD&D Second Edition, where every page has like a monster drawing on it. Whereas if we look in the player's handbook for 5th edition, which has lots of lovely artwork in it, don't get me wrong, there is easily like 10 times that number of like artists that are listed, to the point where I'm not going to list them all out here because it'd take so long in this episode. I mean, there must be...
I'm looking now to see if I see
there must be like 40 artists in there at least, and I expect a lot of these were given just like 1 or 2 things to do because they were doing these big, involved, sort of very detailed pictures. Whereas you can tell in the AD&D Second Ed Monster Manual, each person was given like, right, you're in charge of the humanoids, right, you're in charge of these, you're in charge of that, right, here's the monsters we need. And I think that's probably part of the reason why they're simple as well, because they had so many sketches they needed to like knock out and get to a presentable format that they wouldn't have had time to make each one like a lovely like oil painting style like panorama.
Exactly. So, yeah, the artwork in 5th Ed and many other modern games is amazing artwork. I do like the work by those artists, but for the purposes of a roleplay book, sometimes I'd rather have something that's just that little bit janky, something that's not quite so intimidating.
Yeah, so if I'm correct, what you're saying is you found the sort of earlier artworks more inspirational.
Exactly.
Because it wasn't so far out of reach that you were discouraged and were just like, no, I can't do anything like that. It was like just within reach. So, I mean, don't get me wrong, I probably still couldn't draw as well as like the stuff in the Monster Manual, but there's less of a gulf between like your amateur's level of ability and the artwork that was in there. And I've got to admit, as you were saying, with art sort of like drawing you into the game, we mentioned Tony DiTilizzi earlier on, who pretty much did most of the artwork for the Planescape campaign.
He did the goblins and fairies in the Monster Manual.
And anyone who knows Planescape, it had this weird sort of strange sort of sci-fi fantasy sort of deal, and had a very unique atmosphere, its own slang. It was just a very unique campaign setting, and a lot of that was down to DiTilizzi's artwork. And one of the first books I ever picked up for sort of D&D was one of the old Monstrous Compendiums for Planescape, and the pictures of like the Gith and the Gith Yankee and stuff like that, the animal, like the cat lords and stuff like that in it. That was what really grabbed my attention about that book. It was so visually striking, but again, not because it was like the best artwork in the world, or it was all these ridiculous panoramas. Don't get me wrong, it was good artwork, but it was because it was like quirky and a little bit individual that really sort of like drew me to it. And as you say, I can certainly see why he would have got the goblins in the old Monster Manual. There is something very sort of like Bowie's Labyrinth about about the pictures that he's done.
Yeah. So, anything else you want to say about the art in there?
It's your episode.
I think I'm done raving about it. I think I might want to go and draw us in the style of D&D characters from the Second Ed book.
And that's fair enough. I'm sure we can always use some new artwork to go on the podcast banner, love. So we hope you guys have enjoyed this episode with us waxing lyrical and nostalgically about the old D&D artwork. Some of the things we liked, some of the things we didn't like. If you want to drop us some suggestions about what you'd like to see in future episodes, or you maybe want to comment on this one or any other previous ones we've done, we'd love to hear from you. You can leave us a voicemail using SpeakPipe. There's a link in the description of this show, or you can send us an email to rddrpgpodcast@gmail.com. Until we see you next time, take care, stay safe, and keep gaming.
Bye. Bah.